and make it a huge deal, right? This looks like basically that's the world that opposition has to defend on their side of the house, because that's what's happening in the status quo. So two layers of now why this doesn't work. Firstly, violence makes things worse. The reasoning for this is because it's twofold. Firstly, you alienate the police force. This means that yes, you get a conviction on Derek Chauvin when he killed George Floyd, but calling for defunding police and creating protests where you attack the police force every single day is not good to handle, to get the support of police unions, to get the support of a lot of allies that they could get on their side of the house, right? You fail when you alienate the police force in a way and make them public enemy number one. You fail. You don't get any support from them in the first place towards your goal. And secondly, you just incite the violence even worse, right? You make it seem like you're going after their jobs, their livelihoods, their personal individual lives. That's just racial tensions even more. So we think that violence further perpetuates the problem, and they need to prove why that's not the case in order for them to win. Second layer is that there isn't any national attention on the problem anymore. Why is this, right? This is because the news cycle is already over, right? This is prevalent in the news, especially when the election happened. BLM is simply not in the national headlights anymore, and there's no attention to change whatsoever, right? BLM still may be a huge movement around the world, but news organizations are not capturing any moment of it. Without the attention, without the national headlight on the problem, they cannot get any change because of the fact that nobody's paying attention to it. No lawmakers are paying attention to the BLM movement right now. It's only like the fringe politicians who are minorities themselves who are pushing change, right? There is no national attention to it, meaning at the end of the day, nobody will push for the change anymore. Thirdly, the changes that have happened, for example, in Minnesota, when they changed like some police force code to it, it's very minor. It's mainly they failed to take into account the structural racism, for example, in training where there's not sensitivity training. For example, in Ferguson, for example, it's mainly white police force in a mainly Black district, right? We think that these are the changes that they still fail to bring up, and that are the main causes of racial tension and racial violence in the status quo. So for these three reasons, we think that's why the status quo do not work at all in the current world, and they need to prove that point in order to win. Now, going on to my second point about our mechanization of how we actually change the police force from within. Three layers of analysis to this. Firstly, when you actually get more people to join the police force, they're going to have to be put through training. So being the active members of the social movements that they are, they're going to notice different things that are going to affect racial minorities. So being the diligent social movement people that they are, what are they going to do, right? They're going to point it out towards the police force. They're going to point it out during training so that if there is racial biases, you can point it out. If there is a lack of racial sensitivity training, you can change it, right? When you actively put more members of the social movement into the police force, you can actively point out different things that are tremendously wrong, that do cause a lot of racial violence in the status quo. So from that first layer, you're able to change the structure immediately when you get into training. Secondly, when you join the force, you're able to help officers. Why is this? Firstly, you are able to basically form a connection with them, right? When you form a connection with anybody, that you're able to change their racial beliefs because of the fact that you are friends, right? You are able to hang out, you're able to confront different racial stereotypes that are largely perpetuated on you. Secondly, not only because of the connection, you can focus on de-escalation when actually handling criminals and handling different incidents, right? For example, in Ferguson, if they had a Black officer on charge, not even just a Black officer who or a part of the social movement to push for change, you're able to actively push for de-escalation rather than confrontation, right? Therefore, we think that this is able to actively change the police force within the line of duty. Lastly, when you actively get to a bigger part of the police force, you're able to basically change the structure from the very top. Because when you actively become a good part of the police force, you're able to rise through the ranks, you're able to change a lot of the minute details in the lower parts of the police force, and therefore able to make huge structural changes that are not evident in the current status quo. So for all these reasons I brought to you today, this is why I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we call upon the leader of oppositions to open the case from the negative side.
Oh, wait. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Um, I'll be starting my speech. Wait. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let me first review the argument made by the side government that the PM said that violence is not good and how by encouraging African American police joining police force can better curb the violence. We said that it's not true because we do have African American police, but yet we still see the rise of hate crimes. Therefore, by encouraging African American entering police force, is still not enough because they still face hate and discrimination within the police force itself. The African American police might still remain powerless and shunned when they try to bring up justice for the minority. And the Prime Minister also didn't cover a clear roadmap how their side can better prevent the rising of hate crimes, violence, and instead keep stating how changing it from within can better curb it when it's impossible because they're still facing discrimination by the police itself. Okay, before I go on to my substantives, let me characterize the motion today. First, we characterize social movements like Black Lives Matter are oftentimes comprise progressive and liberal individuals and activists that support investing in community security rather than the police and other progressive views. Police forces in the US are the main source of controversy for the Black Lives Matter movement ever since the killing of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and recently George Floyd that sparked riots around the US. The US police force is known for actively discriminating and police disproportionately African Americans because of the practices and ideas that are condoned by the higher ups in the police force. Other than that, let me lay out the stances, burdens, and stakeholder in this debate today. Our stance is very simple and clear cut. That joining the police force will be counterproductive to the movement and would result in little to minimal change. And the main burden on our side would be to prove that social movement like Black Lives Matter will draw flag and outrage from their main supporters, and that the police force are still institutionally a racist system. Furthermore, the key stakeholders involved in my argument will be social movement themselves and African Americans. Now we should move on to my substantive in this debate today. First, there is the main problem that I have with this motion today. Keep in mind that the police force are the ones that are responsible for the harsh killings ever since the 90s, for the harsh killings, discriminatory arrests, and prejudice policing that lasts for years on end ever since the 90s to even now. The recent killing of George Floyd has sparked the need to defund the police and invest more community welfare instead by the Black Lives Matter movement, a grassroots movement that requires not only financial backing for ordinary individuals, but also the political support that is needed to bring systematic changes that disproportionately affect African Americans. This is where my argument ties in nicely with the solution that our side will be supporting. My first argument would be that by encouraging the oppressed to concede and to side with their oppressor would draw more flag to the movement that is the main source of support for African Americans right now. The main argument is this argument is true on two bases. First, the main demographic of the Black Lives Matter movement are activists and individuals, particularly African Americans, that when systemic reforms that includes defunding the police. This means that their main source of support come from marginalized and disenfranchised African American community that has suffered from discriminatory policy in the first place. Something African Americans just can't forgive and forget since it has been years after years where this happened and with little to no chance to bring any sort of story rejected changes to the police force. Hence, why they now want to defund it and invest in things like community welfare or education for African Americans instead. The more in which the Black Lives Matter movement side with individuals that continuously perpetuates this cycle of poverty and oppression against Black individuals is also the moment that the Black Lives Matter just lost their biggest source of financial and political capital to bring that sort of needed change that can benefit African American, and it means that the main source of activism and support for the African Americans become fractured because the movement paint itself as licking the boots of the establishments and fine with status quo that actively discriminate against African Americans. Secondly, the police force is an inherently
POI.
rejected institution in the US. Just because you encourage black individuals to join doesn't mean that they will. A lot of people are victims or their relatives are victims of the discriminatory system of the police force. And it's just something that African American can't ever forgive for. This means that it's highly unlikely that African American will even want to join against the very system that have harmed their relatives or even themselves, and are much more likely to abandon the movement in its entirety for supporting such a controversial view on the police force, and whitewash and minimize the harms that the police force has perpetrated upon to the Black Lives Matter individuals. On the our side, we believe that our solution can solve the problem that I mentioned just now, because now that the Black Lives Matter movement retain their financial and political support and be the main voice
POI.
of discriminated African Americans demanding for systemic change that can benefit everyone in general. After our solution is able to solve said problem, we say that not only can we ease the sort of racial tension that's present, but also allow for more investment for things like education or community welfare instead. This is also only exclusive to our side, because their policy will only worsen the problem by drawing backlash from their main source of support and portray an image that is not consistent with what African Americans demand. I said that our side paints a realistic pictures of what will happen on the both sides and thus should win on comparative as well. Before I end my speech, I would like the state government to confront these few questions head on. First, knowing that their main source of support are activists and progressives, how are you still able to retain support amongst said base? Ladies and gentlemen, a world with such goals could only be achieved by our side, and thus I have never been bothered to oppose for the motion today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, today we see that our opposition bench essentially ignores the state of the status quo right now, right? They basically give us a case that is built upon the fact that things are not completely true. For example, they tell you that the BLM has enough financial support, in which right now, if they're not even able to get the foothold of getting onto national news, we don't think they even have enough resources left. So you see that the movement has now started to quiet down, even though there are still activists pushing for it. So seeing that their entire argument is based off the stance that defunding police will essentially change how the police forces and reform them better than you would have if people directly went in under our model, right? So today I'll be providing you with 3 pieces of rebuttals, and then further on pushing on to arguments that have been led on by my first speaker, and then also providing you with a comparative of why that our model works more efficiently than the status quo, right? So first of all, we would like to remind our opposition that in the current status quo, we see that there aren't as many I guess lawmakers or in general officials who are still looking at fighting for the BLM movement, right? Because they still understand that the BLM is important, but it's just not on the priority list, because the changes that you have gotten so far right now with defunding is at most that you have these police officers wearing body cams, right? You have not been able to change racial profiling. You have not been able to change excessive response and de-escalation in police training due to racial violence. And also, they have not been able to change these things that are core values of how they train police, right? In which we don't think our opposition has engaged in their first speaker, right? And secondly, they tell you that since these police forces are often like hurting and having these police people of color under victims, so you can't forgive them, right? So we would like to ask them if they would like to disband the police in general, right? Because since you frame the police as oppressors that will not change, then there's no point of having the police forces anymore if it's just going to be a single unit of oppressors, right? So we don't think that that point stands solidly. And thirdly, they tell us that the police forces are known for discriminating against racist matters due to their practices, right? And which this is exactly why that we think we want to have people of color police officers go into the training programs to understand and to see what are the issues in training, right? For example, if you get a black officer who essentially goes into a training police program in order to become a police, they see that in training, for example, recognizing crime rates, they are being taught that, for example, black neighborhoods has a higher crime rate for drug abuse, right? But the thing is, they might this is of course based off statistics, but when they go through this training program, they will at least try to provide a feedback towards these people who are training them and to tell them that to be more sensitive about this training, right? Or at least maybe give it more all-rounded training based on racial profiling, right? For example, also including profiling for different types of races, or in general just trying to generalize how to spot these criminals based on more non-racial features of this person. So we think that with all three of these claims that they have made, we're not sure exactly how they stand, even if they keep ignoring the status quo, right? Okay, so first of all, I'd like to expand further on why that the current movement and the current status quo is right now making it harder for movements like BLM to achieve their goals, right? We think that by alienating the police force, you are making them and instead yourself the target of the attack, right? Yes, you go and convict different police officers for doing their racial crimes, right? But you're still not changing how these police are made in the first place. How are they changed in the first place, right? We think that by defunding police, our opposition has not given us a clear model of how by defunding the police, will you directly get change across these police officers. While in my first speaker speech, we have reminded you that with these changes of having these police officers going into the training programs, we're able to get insider change and a more effective and quicker change. Because right now in the status quo, we see this Black Lives Movement has been going on nearly a year, and we still have not seen substantial change within their programs, right? And secondly, no, thank you. And secondly, with having these backlash coming from racial, most of the time these backlashes to these police officers are from racial incited violence, right? For example, the Asian hate example, the current movement has failed to encourage more police officers to protect the people of color, but rather just fueled more anti-police sentiments. And we think that this is ineffective, which I'll explain later, right? And so I think on our side, the conclusion is that the strategy has failed in our status quo. And it's time to rethink a world where how we can have a world where the people of color feel more protected and in fact changes it from the inside, right? As we don't think that the current status quo works, right? And so moving on to my second point, we think that these communities are most affected by racial inequality issues from police forces are being helped by our motion, right? After our model is in place, we see a change in racial balances in police forces of the neighborhood town, right? Our opposition may further take this in their second speech by telling us that these people are essentially discriminating against white officers because you're basically making it harder for white officers to become officers in more Black communities, right? But we think that that is just how we want the demographic to be, right? We want the police force to be dependent and reflective on the demographic of where they are policing it, right? For example, if you get a Black neighborhood with a tons of white cops, as I've said earlier, as my first speaker I've said, we think that that is counterproductive, and instead of de-escalating violence, they usually escalate the conflict to a point where there are a loss of lives, right? But instead, we think that if you're allowing these police officers to have, for example, majority Black people in a Black neighborhood, we get a reflective of majority Black officers in these neighborhoods. We think this is the only more fair, equal, and also a more reliable way for these police officers to resonate and relate and to deal with issues and understand the community better, right? And we think this is only exclusive to our side, because on opposition, they're alienating them and further pushing away the chance for these changes to occur, right? So overall, why is our model more efficient right now? in the status quo right now, there aren't many of these more activists who are essentially making grassroots changes, right? But instead, which is exactly why our model will want these minorities to be in the police force and in turn try to close the gap between the BLM movement and the police forces. But we think this promotes further unity within the US and, for example, for the BLM movement, redirecting the anger from alienating police forces into mending and providing and improving something that has been torn apart due to these movements and due to these activists, right? So we think that on our side, we're able to harness power of social media and gain foothold we had, and in order to push for more change within the police force. So this is why this motion stands. Thank you. That was shaky.
Okay. I think spectator, you need to mute yourself. Thank you for that speech. We call upon the deputy leader oppositions. But please, spectator, mute yourself.
I want to check whether this is audible.
Yes, it's audible.
Okay, so my preferred gender pronoun would be a he, and I prefer if you can raise your POI via opening your cams so that you are indicating me that you want to ask a POI instead of interrupting my speech. Okay, appreciate it. Thank you so much for cooperating. Okay, just give me a second. I'll start my speech soon. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Ladies and gentlemen, the culture within the police departments is often cited. New recruits learn to perform police work by observing the practices of their colleagues, internalizing them, and then executing them. Pressure to conform to a prevailing police culture plays a critical role in shaping behavior and determining how officers treat civilians of different races. Officers of color are not exempt from this process. They may even feel obliged to adopt to the values of the department to fit in or advance their careers. Any long-term solution to excessive police violence needs to address the conditions in which marginalized communities live. Black people in the US are disproportionately living in the neighborhoods that are characterized as pervasive inequality, joblessness, poverty, and inadequate public services, conditions in which crimes has traditionally thrived. Addressing to the structural inequalities at the root of urban crime will go a long way to reducing police violence. So to start off my speech today, I will give rebuttals to DPM to better re-clarify and defend our stance. And therefore, I will introduce my main argument, which includes the worst case scenario on the other side, and lastly, some comparatives. So rebuttals to DPM. DPM has never engaged with our arguments today because he claims that the black will enter police training and sort of becoming successful. 2 rebuttals here. On the Dell side, they cannot guarantee that even when the black enter the training, there are still the existence and the presence of prejudice and unfair treatment. Secondly, state government has provided no checks and balances to prove whether Afro-Americans will ever pass the training, right? Now we should move on to my main argument, which is the race-based social movement in the US by encouraging African-Americans to join the police force can never, ever address the root causes of racial discrimination. So why this is true? 3 premises. The first premise is that once police force as an entire unit encourages African American to join them, which happens as side government really wants, and they are so obsessed with it. However, we don't know how the Afro-Americans are going to be discriminated at first in the police force unit, right? The entire police force unit now invites the black people to join them, but it has never proven to us that they have totally eliminated the element of racial discrimination in their workplace, meaning that they now have a reason to say, hey, now the police force unit has black people here, so we are not discriminating them, right? I would say sees this as an excuse to really solve the problem, and this will never truly solve the root causes of racial discrimination against the black people. So second premise is that on our side, the police force are the ones who are most responsible for actively discriminating African Americans. So just take a look at the murder of George Floyd last year, which happened last year. So our side is trying to tell that the moment they even encourage African Americans to put their lives in danger by requesting the Afro Americans to simply just join the police force, which is so deeply penetrated by a lot of unknown variables, which like we don't know who in the police workforce is not a racist or who is a racist then. There is no proper checks and balances on the Dell side as to how they can make sure once police workforce recruits Afro Americans, meaning every single one of the police is not racist, right? So side government based their entire case and assumption like by telling us, yeah, once Afro-Americans join police force, meaning the racial tension have completely been eliminated. So that's not really the case, right? Police force as a body or unit encourages Afro-Americans. It doesn't mean to join them. It doesn't mean that the individual policemen and policewomen are no longer racist, right? The premise here is that in police force, once a white police, for example, kills a black person, they also have a higher chance to get qualified immunity, meaning police officers are exempted from personal liabilities, like, for example, they don't have to face charges and things like that. This is a social stigma that has deeply rooted in the US society, and this stigma can never be solved under side government with the entire roadmap of just actively encouraging Afro-Americans to join the police force. They are basically painting a false image that the perspective of each individual police working in the police force can be united under the police force as a whole, meaning they assume once police force unit encourages Afro-Americans to join them, meaning each and every police is willing to do so, right? That's not always the case. However, our side has better ability to solve the social stigma that causes racial discrimination in the first place. Sorry, no. And our race-based social movements and our mechanism and policy goes as follows. Before moving on to that, we have to first acknowledge the status quo in America. The policy under side government can never solve the problematic police culture and issues of distrust against the police. The residents will only be more likely to cooperate when they view the police positively, right? So second of all, structural inequality in society is another cause. How does hiring black police officers help to elevate the economic status of the black people? Therefore, our mechanism is that government must first help the economically poor black people, because keep in mind, blacks are often discriminated due to two reasons. Rejected. One is that the lack of accessibility to proper education and due to the poor economic situation of the black families, which caused the young Afro-Americans choose to give up schools and start working in order to sustain their lives. So second of all, is that the social prejudice against the black community by not respecting their human rights as not as important as the white people or the rest of the communities. So the government has provided aid. The government has to provide aid to the black community and access to education. Rejected. Therefore, why this is so important. Under our side, the main stakeholders involved are the black community. Once the blacks economic and the younger generation are able to have access to education, and therefore it increases the work opportunity for them, and therefore we can only address the root causes of racial discrimination, because we're not trying to tell you, we're not trying to make the, basically because we are trying to make the black people regain their respect in the American society, either by achieving success in their work or education. Because once the black community gain access to education, just like other races do, we are slowly transforming the lives of the black community as a whole. Rejected. So now let's move on to some comparatives. The main comparatives here, which proves our side is significantly better than their side, is very simple. We know just by actively encouraging African Americans to join the police force can never address the root causes of racial discrimination, right? So their side basically paints a completely false picture by just assuming that, yes, they can make sure the police are not racist because now, hey, the police unit welcome the black people, right? So we are not racist, right? This is false. So our side has proven to you that racial discrimination can only be solved via governmental fund to aid the black community and give them access to education. And this is only exclusive to side opposition. Thank you so much. Therefore, our side should win on these comparatives as well. So before I end my speech, I would like side government to answer to only one straight question. Listen carefully. Given the fact that the police force as a big unit actively encourages African Americans to join the police force has never meant that each and every police is no longer a racist. Therefore, how can your side prove that once the police force actively encourage African Americans to join the police force, you are actually solving the root causes of racial discrimination even better than how our side can actually do it? Our side has provided with you the complete roadmap as to prove that why our side is better in terms of addressing the root causes of racial discrimination. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we call upon the government whip to close the case from the government.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
May I begin my speech? Okay. A time starts in 3, 2, 1. What we have seen in this whole debate from all of their speakers is we're left with more questions than answers. What are these questions? Number one, they have not shown what does their model of defunding, what does it actually look like? How can you achieve change whilst retaining the BLM's financial support or things such as that, what they have said from their first speech? How does a non-effective law enforcement, which is the final end result that we see from their side, create substantial positive change for these communities who are stakeholders in this debate? And how do the African communities with higher crime rates, which need more enforcement, are helped by the less manpower, by the narrative of hating the police because of the BLM and the model of the funding in the current status quo, which they support, right? Therefore, number one, we see no clear setup, and we don't know what sort of line they will draw in this debate. We don't see how their points are justified because of all these questions, because you don't frame the problems in the status quo clearly, and ultimately, finally, the all fail to realize the nuance of our arguments. This debate is not just about the ineffective policing. It's about creating substantial change via this narrative. It's about creating racial balance. It's about answering the questions and helping finish the job that you guys failed to do. Let's finish and win all three of these clashes. What are the main clashes which they failed to identify in this debate? One, which side creates the best, most efficient way to create change within these police forces? Two, how do we benefit the communities? And three, which side prevents the system abuse or at least reduces that? Number one, let's go into how we win on the side of gradual change. What do we see on their side? The main problem in the status quo, which is the whole idea of what they support, is you can't achieve a more diverse makeup of the police force, e.g. adding an African-American officers faster than our model. Then you also see the second point that there's less POC or people of color police officers in power on their side. You see there's a more abusive system via cases such as George Floyd, and they don't seem to answer these questions of how their model will solve that problem. Our cases have brought up the model. We push for gradual change. And let me reiterate that again. The gradual change is how we win this debate. How is this? Because we reiterate the education of the training process, right? We're able to identify when you go through training, this is what the new system will look like. Why is this? Because when you have African Americans, when you have more inclusion in the police force, when you encourage more of them to join the police force, number one, not only do you have more of African Americans officers in power, this allows for higher amounts of discussion. This allows for them to at least work together, because then again, you won't have a primarily over 50% white police force, which is the current statistics, right? You'll have more black police officers, and you're then forced to create this gradual change because they are not the majority anymore, because they're not being oppressed anymore, right? Ultimately, you see that things such as racial profiling will reduce heavily, and the end result is we have a less problematic less racist and more diverse plus educated police force, which is achieved via this narrative my first few speakers have talked about, without any engagement from their side. Their only viable solution is to defund. But why is this still a problem? Number one, there's no other ways for effective change, but also two, though this may work, it's still problematic. Why? It forces and further pushes the narrative that the police are the enemy. Why is this ultimately the problem? Because they then talk about how communities are supposed to be helped and all that. But then how are they going to be helped if you have a majority 50% white police force being angry because they lost their salary, because they lost their wages, because they lost all these fundings, because of the funding, right? They're not going to be happy. They're not going to magically help you because of the fact that the BLM movement forced them to lose money. They're going to be angry. They're going to have more lives lost, such as people such as George Floyd, unjustified, and they have not realized this reality or even responded to this point at all. What we see in the status quo is a failing institution, how many cops work according to their biases and emotions in comparison to just doing their job and trying to stand from an objective standpoint, right? So defunding just stems more problems within the police, and we do not see how that side really helps them. We see that our model is number one, like the only response to this is our model is counterproductive and how the BLM gets to retain their money. Number one, we see a very unclear model. How is the change going to happen in the police without adding African-American police? Because you don't understand the problem in this debate. The problem in this debate we're trying to solve is not just ineffective policing, it's helping the communities and try to reduce this abusive power system, which are the clashes which have failed to see in this debate. The changes we get right now are very superficial, right? Ultimately, internally in the police force, they're not discussing the issues. All you're giving is a press conference with a black police officer saying, we're sorry, the guy's fired now. Why is this the problem? Because it's a white majority police force, and inclusion, which happens on our side, which is more effective, and they've failed to acknowledge that point, is ultimately the solution, right? When you have more black police officers, we ultimately create the end result of working together for change, for unity, and that is what the BLM should stand for. Then we move on to the points of my second speaker I've talked about, things such as the Ferguson problem, things such as Blacktown white police, right? How do the other stakeholders in the debate, the communities, how are they most helped on our side? Our model solves this by encouraging more to join, right? That changes from a Blacktown white police to Blacktown more majority black police, right? We're trying to reflect the demographics with police, right? When you have more African American officers, you're able to solve problems because they're able to resonate more with their own people, because they're able to still solve crime effectively, but they do not get less of these racial profiling cases ultimately. That's the change in racial balances and the substantive change we need, and they fail to provide. They assume that communities helped on their side. Your side makes the police unwilling to help their side, right? Ultimately, the only responses they say is that having Black police officers won't help the economic situations of Black people. Number one, your side really doesn't help that point. Okay, fine, let's take that point as valid. Your side hasn't proved how you help that instead of your sentence dropping, right? You're just trying to sentence drop the case without any justification. You think that making the majority 50% white police of force who has less wages with your defunding model is going to make them angry. We have repeated this point then and again, and they won't help the economic situation because they're higher crime rates, because white police officers, because of your model, won't help them even more. You see higher crime rates because of the fact that these people are left unattended, these people are left uneducated, and racial profilings will still happen. You're not helping that at all. We say no to that argument. Then we go to the final point of which side supports the system of abuse. Ultimately, what we see on this side, for when we take all the most valid points and even the points that have been defeated, and we still take them as valid, what are the points that we still see standing in today's debate? They support a world of creating a culture where there's no encouragement for the police force to provide a form of meaningful relationship with communities and minorities, right? That means they have a bad understanding of the current issues within those minorities without these people of color officers, people especially such as African American. The key of police work is to crime prevention, right? Things such as good patrols in color communities with high crime rates are the ultimate solution to that problem. What do we see on ops case, right? They won't help because number one, they are defunded, so there's less manpower. They're trying to de-police, they're trying to disband them. Why would they bother helping why would they bother help the minorities if they ultimately hate us? Things such as the BLM movement, things that the policy ultimately pushes for is not going to help them. That's why we must change the narrative for unity, to push for substantial change. Then what we go to is all they say is that people of color officers will still face discrimination. And that's the only standing response from this debate so far. We're pushing for gradual change. Let's reiterate that. We sacrifice the temporary criticisms, 1 or 2, or maybe 100 or 200 of better police force, which I've said is a wide range people with less racial profilings. By finding the root of the issue, which we've talked about in our speech, we're able to change and create a better police reform. And all they say is that case is ultimately bad with mediocre responses. They provide no substantive, no clear setup, and we can't really justify their points if we have to question all the time, will this work? Will this work through all of the clashes which they fail to even identify? For all these reasons, this is why we should absolutely debate and they should lose.
Thank you. And then we call upon the opposition's whip to close the debate.
I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Thank you, thank you. Be setting my timer and then I'll be done. Give me a moment here. Yes, that was a really good speech. I'm so nervous. I'll be starting my speech in 3, God, sorry, 2, 1. It is of the unfortunate fact that police brutality is only exposed when it is caught on tape, revealing the fact that the police force is a system that actively avoids accountability and discriminates against racial minorities, particularly African American. What government's first argument that the status quo right now fails? A few responses to this argument and the various arguments within it. Violence makes things worse, sure, but you seriously have to understand that the BLM is not a violent movement to begin with. Even when they advocate for defunding the police, nor does it make that an idea that is inherently bad, right? Violence is going to be worse under their side of the house, in fact, especially when the BLM now lacks any sort of legitimacy to protect African Americans, because the moment the African Americans withdraw their financial and political support for the BLM because they support the police, is the moment in which we say the BLM can't sufficiently protect African American and demand for more systemic change to the police force right now. This means that African Americans don't have a coordinating agent, nor any sort of political traction to demand for more sort of systemic change, right? BLM can't, BLM saying to support and join the police are going to reinvigorate more anger against both the movement itself and the police force. It doesn't mean that they'll join the police force, but instead are going to be so much more angrier and direct the anger towards the police force because it doesn't quell that hatred against the police side for discriminatory policing, for racist facial recognition, for example, or police brutality. They gravely mischaracterize how the BLM movement actually looks like and how does it operate. Second, just because you make people join the police force and go for training does not mean that such training or practices are going to be called out to begin with. The higher ups are the ones that are calling the shots and are the ones that have the ability to alienate or even fire African Americans for calling out racial biases within their own training. So that's our mechanization won't make sure want to make sure by virtue of the ones that are calling the shots are not black officers, but instead the higher ups within the police force, nor can investing in police forces alleviate from the sort of economic conditions that black individuals are in right now. That's why we say defund the police. We use that money for things like black education. We use that thing better access to health education. They just don't do that. It's a waste of money to invest in the police that actively discriminate against African Americans, right? Third, it talks about de-escalation and more integration within the police force. But you have to understand that this argument is contingent on the idea that police force are going to disregard their training simply because a black police officer says so. If that is truly the case, then it will be weird that violence against African Americans are still high despite having black individuals within the police force. Nor can the PM guarantee that black individuals can even integrate themselves into the police force to begin with, right? Simply because police officers right now don't even have a good perception of black individuals to begin with, and that view is further ingrained and hammered down by discriminatory practices within the police force, not to mention the fact that black individuals are going to face more prejudices, more unfair treatment. PM gave C's and D's, but never proved A's and B's as to why black individuals would even want to join the police force to begin with. We actively encourage them to join. That's the motion. Not pointing a gun, point black at them to join the police force, right? Now, what did the DPM talk about before that? Sure, POI.
Okay, so how are you going to keep the African Americans safe? By defunding the police and also adding the funding to community as per to your motto. But then where does the security come from? Where does the law enforcement come from? When you derive that defunding narrative, when you derive that.
That's why we invest in community welfare, where people take care of one another instead of letting the police do so. That's what AOC and many other progressive liberals within Congress is pushing for right now. That is the mechanism that we want communities to protect one another and not be reliant on the government force that is inherently racist to begin with, right? Now, moving on, what did the DPM say? They draw the classic backlash argument. My free response to this: I think it is perfectly fine to be against the police force in the US right now because they're the ones that continuously brutalize communities to begin with, right? Just because it is reflective of their demographic does not necessarily mean that the training or the practices within the police force will be in any way inclusive, right? That's why we see black on black violence by police officers, because they are still ingrained and trained with discriminatory practices and so much more. Only black communities and mostly black individuals, even when they themselves are part of that community in the first place. Second, he talks about the fact that the police may target us, may target BLM. The police already targets us now, regardless, right? The main problem that exists now is that even when you have black individuals within the police force, that does not mean things like discriminatory facial recognition, manipulative arrest warrants, and so on will then miraculously disappear from training. There's I can't guarantee that this harm is somewhat exclusive to our side of the house. Under your side of the house, not only can the police force utilize black police officers to justify police brutality or be tokenistic mascots that whitewashes the green practices within the police industry, side opposition actively alienates the only source of support for African Americans right now in the status quo and BLM movement. Third, the problem like brutality and escalation of violence are problems within the police force right now. So why don't we just instead defund the main source of the police? No, thank you. And use that money to instead invest in things like community security, black welfare, black education. They can help alleviate black people from that cycle of poverty and in the result reducing crime rates in the process, right? Never took into account our argument and our characterization of the BLM. They never engaged with our arguments as to why the BLM would even be successful politically and financially to bring out and demand this all change, because you need to understand that the people within are progressive and liberals and African Americans that don't like the police. The moment they kiss the boots of the police is the moment that they withdraw the support for the BLM. And and not only did that happen, the government would only bought out debating judges and word cannon with no source of analysis whatever. Now I'll be dealing with one clash that he kept talking about: gradual change. A key problem with that clash is that you're actively encouraging them, not forcing them to join, right? This means that it's on the case that all the arguments are contingent on this, and therefore even when we say the black people join the police force, they still suffer from prejudice, they still suffer from unfair treatment, and the problematic policing culture that they have to internalize and learn from by the higher ups, right? This means that on the very best case where people actively join, it is contingent on the assumption that such practices can even be rooted out to begin with, but it can't because it is so ingrained within the police force now. The police barely help black people to begin with right now. The fact that in such horrid economic conditions that results in more and more discriminatory practices in police because we keep investing in the police instead of black education, that is what perpetuates this cycle of oppression, right? But what about our side? We said that when the moment that we have more financial political capital, the more that we can demand for change within Congress, the more that we see qualified immunity, discrimination recognition being ended. But even on the worst scenario where we can't bring in, the changes or defunding the police and investing, at least we bring in some sort of greater change, right? We said that the moment that the outrage becomes so big, like the one in George Floyd, is able to end practices within the police force, like any qualified immunity, and then have being more inclusive of the people within the police force, right? Be moving higher out the outrages, right? These are the things that exist on our side of the house because we draw more media scrutiny over these things compared to their side of the house. Please don't use any more debating jargons or word candy because that won't work in the debate. And also that I'm very proud to oppose this, to support or oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And we call on the reply speaker from the negative side.
Hello, I want to check again whether this is audible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for responding. Just give me a second. Okay, I'll be starting my reply speech in 3, 2, and 1. Ladies and gentlemen, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There's a lot of things that need to change, specifically justice for Blacks and police brutality. And we are up in a race against the tide. First of all, why should this debate essentially go to our side? Firstly, my LO has stated that by encouraging the oppressed to concede with their oppressors, the police force would draw more flack to the movement. But instead, Black Lives Matter should retain their financial and political support and be the main voice of discriminated African Americans, while easing the existing racial tension by allowing more investment for education. Racial tension in the American communities by getting the blacks working in the police unit and gain pay and have a happy life and things like that. However, their main witness is that they have never engaged with our arguments at all, and no acknowledgement of how Black Lives Matter actually looks like, and no proof as to how such benefits can even be materialized. Second of all, they failed to prove to us how they are able to make sure that every police are no longer racist immediately after the police unit actively recruiting Afro-Americans, right? And third of all, they base their entire assumption by painting a false image to this debate today, that the Blacks are even able to pass the police training in the first place, given that racial discrimination heavily exists under their side and heavily influences their side. And therefore, the key that distinguishes our side than their side is that we have proven to you that the racial discrimination in the American society against the Black communities can only be solved when the Black people are deemed as important as other races. And this can only be solved by our solution and our roadmap, which is the US government should therefore provide aid and ensure the access to education to the Black community. And that's the only two ways to make sure that the Black community are well respected in the US society. Again, the social stigma in the US society is that the increasing amount of the social prejudice against the Black people, and these can only be eliminated under our side. Thank you so much. So third of all, and the last part of my reply speech is that what are the clashes we're talking about here and how both benches actually deal with the points of clash. The main clash in today's debate is gradual change. And the Dell side, they have stated that the changes should be made within the police force where the Black police go under training. However, this is irrelevant as there is no guarantee they are able to pass the training when they are still facing a lot of pressure, racial discrimination, and prejudice within the police force itself. And their solutions are actually worsening the issue they just brought. So they can't make any big changes within the police force. However, under our side, we allow BLM movement to retain the financial and political support, where they should only focus on more investment towards the community welfare and education. We have also proven to you how can we better prevent prejudice as well as easing the racial tension that's currently existing within a police force that's inherently racist itself. Therefore, please, I beg you, please heed to side opposition. Thank you so much. Proud to oppose today's motion.
Thank you. And then to close the debate, we call upon the reply speaker from the affirmative side.
Just to make sure, can you guys hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. There are 6 huge reasons why side opposition has fundamentally lost today's debate. Firstly, they ignore the entirety of our setup and the entirety of our free speeches we've given prior. They literally said, oh, how will people join the police? Why will African Americans join the police force when they're the ones being oppressed? Ignoring the fact that literally in our setup, we told you how the BLM will be framing it as changing the police force, which is what they want anyway, which is what progressives want. We've responded to this multiple times, but they just ignored our rebuttals and ignored our engagement and just repeated the same thing over and over again. Second thing we did wrong, they have no mechanism whatsoever to their case at all. We keep on hearing, oh, we want to give the communities back, we want to give them welfare, we want to give them money. But keep in mind, they, on side opposition, don't have fiat. They have to prove to us why the political and financial political and financial support that the BLM movement have and other social movements have are enough to actually incite change in the system. They ignore the status quo, which we pointed out throughout our entire bench, that the status quo doesn't even have any changes that are substantial, right? We pointed out that all the funding, all the things that they already have in the status quo, but they've done nothing with it. They've done nothing. They've done nada, right? It's entirely flawed. Their mechanism is flawed. Their comparatives is flawed. That's another reason why we win today's debate. Thirdly, they fail to engage with many of our points. Firstly, they fail to engage with our national tension point. We told you how without national tension, these social justice movements don't have enough political power and political with the actual specifics of their case, and they've failed to actually failed to respond to anything, right? Adding on to the fact that they also failed, they only answered 2 of our PYs, it's really problematic. For this thing they did wrong is that they pushed burdens that we didn't even take in this speech. For example, in their reply speaker, when they tried to push the fact that we wanted to push for change immediately after POC's officers joined the police force, we never took that burden. I think he stated in his own speech, he wants to push for gradual change, which is so much better than the status quo. Note this burden push, and note how they try to do it so late to paint us as the worst house. Last thing they did wrong is they had horrible responses that were repeated throughout the whole bench, which was poorly made. Anyways, first response, we told us, oh, these officers will just get normalized training and will not change any structural reasons. Despite the fact that even our first speaker, I preempted that these people are from the social justice movement. They know the things that need to change, and they will actively point it out because of the fact that they want change in the system. Second thing they kept on repeating, oh yeah, model works because of the fact that we give community welfare to the system. Therefore, we somehow change racial justice, right? For example, in San Francisco, there's a lot of Asian restaurants. But why is there still Asian hate happening, right? Yes, more building help lower crime rates. That's not the thing we see in the status quo. Thinking, there's already there's already a lot of racial, a lot of police discrimination against BLM already, but they fail to acknowledge it precisely because you alienate police force. They proved our own points without even acknowledging it. Because of these 6 reasons, this is why I'm so proud to propose. This is why you must give the wins to side proposition. Thank you.
Thank you for all the speakers for this debate. So yeah, this is the end of the debate. So you can leave this room and also the spectator, because we're going to use this room as a deliberations room. Thank you.
Thanks. It was a good debate. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you all for the debate. It was a nice one.
PTHS and also CIS. Can you leave this breakout room, please?
Mr. Lai, we need to discuss, and so can you end the recording and leave this room? Can the recording be stopped, please?
I think all the spectators already gone. So in the meantime, you can take your time in around few minutes, but after you have your decisions, please privately message me on the Zoom what is your call. Thank you.
Noted.